Hello everyone, today we talk about another chapter of Italian communal history and in particular observing the relation between the communal authority and the private one of the countryside in the, let's say, towards the late 13th century. This is a process that, as we will see, can encompass also a broader, even other centuries, telling the truth in its dynamic, and it is to be found in other areas of Europe. But as we've seen countless times, in Italy we have this exception of a city-state that is probably a state within itself, not just a town, and that's a state that is capable of taking over the surrounding district or even other cities, which is, again, something that in the rest of Europe doesn't quite occur, and so represent an exception worth analyzing. So, as you know, at this point we have made a lot of videos about communal history in general, and it's completely by chance that fundamentally we haven't gotten, if not with very few exceptions, into the history of the single cities. But it's really important to have a broader understanding of this all and the whole of them, to reason in theoretical terms, that is comparative, still quite concretely and practically, as far as properly the communal government was concerned, for a number of reasons. First of all, because the city-states were something like 30 altogether, so we can't really stop in each one. There were sensible differences between the same, but those shouldn't quite fool, broadly speaking, because you see, if you start approaching this area from just studying city by city, the problem is that you will probably lose great part of the main political institutional changes. You can observe them, yes, in a city or in the other, and generally speaking here I'm talking in a truly historical sense, not how the history of cities is made. I remember I made a video about the history of Genoa, half millennium, something like between 1000 to 1500, and that was very, it's just a little tale, we can say, but things were much more complex. In fact, I also created Genoese history of medieval Genoa playlist to collect something a bit more in depth that we were observing at that time. In fact, also, if I remember correctly, the administration of the government, better, of the Genoese mainland, that was quite peculiar, first of all, because it was all kind of mountains, it's the Ligurian Apennine, but also because it was hopelessly fragmented. Like, Genoa never kind of managed to extend its control, differently from other cities in the hinterland, because of this, because of geographic difference, but mostly because of the political fragmentation of various houses that control the city, right? Differently from Venice, that at some point locks the major council and creates this highly sophisticated system for which it maintains a very sound unity of command. Genoa is always ruled by the private houses, and there's practically never a public power that manages to take over, right? The only that manages at the end of the Middle Ages to do it is the Bank of St. George. That is effectively still kind of a private business overlapping with the public one, but it's another story. I don't even remember now what we're talking about. But as we've seen also in many other Italian communal videos, let's say, there was in this region, central northern Italy, a dramatically homogeneous political, institutional, and consequently also military and social development. We made important amount of videos also on, rather than the Italian communal armies, we said something recently, mostly about the relation, in fact, between the Militants and the Populus and the Partes. We made a couple of months ago a video about the Guelphs and Ghibellines that keeps getting lots of views, apparently, because that's an important chapter and people want to know more about that, so probably we'll come back on it as well. And it's that messed up in practice. Of course, we can teach this broader theoretical picture only because we have had historians that have studied all the single cities and came up with the realization by comparing them that there was this, which is, not really difficult to to understand in many ways, also artistically or literary and linguistically in other ways. But that, of course, until you don't really look at the other thing, you can't be completely sure whether it's the same thing in the other areas, right? So the degree of homogeneity in this European region is striking, because it shows how these cities were always practically interfering with each other, at the point that, as always, especially through war, they would become more hybrid too, unavoidably. For many reasons, the mechanisms of the podestas that we partly see now as well, that were exchanged from within the cities, sometimes even an important amount of distance. But with this continuity, with this tradition, this enormous public development and administration. So the period we're looking at now is particular because, I'm making all these various chunks in the timeline, either chronologically or thematically. And so it may not be completely easy to recall all the things I said on that, but it should be seen in a unitary view. Again, that's the best way you can understand any history in practice. And so we are in the, in the second half of the 13th century, this moment in which the Italian communes have basically reached not the top in absolute terms, because this would actually go on for a long time, for a couple of generations and more, especially the process of statalization, right? At this point, however, the Italian communes have topped in relative terms up to that point, that is, their growth, because this is the moment in which the wars against the Germanic emperors fundamentally stop, right? The major ones, the ones in which the Holy Roman Empire could have reaffirmed properly a kind of centralized rule over the Italian city-states, and that the Italian city-states instead managed to repel by maintaining their own autonomies. And therefore, what occurs now, in spite of the fact that Italy was always permeable to external influence, the Swabian, hegemony, we can call it this way, was substituted by the Angevin in Germany, etc. Nobody really factually controlled central and northern Italy, because these centers were too many and too individually powerful to be brought down. And every time you could enter the system, because again, they were always clashing against each other, it was like another faction could fluidly form based on the circumstances, right? And this was basically the story, really. So the point is that these city-states have, up to this point, essentially fought for a good, for several generations against what had been at that point the largest power in Europe, and they have developed, as you know, a dramatically effective political and military system, especially. They are overbearingly rich, and we will see how overbearingly is true, because the system was not stable at all, right? And it was very easy to always reactivate this kind of internal and external instability that could threaten the communal government. And the key, in fact, is understanding what the communal government had come to be to this point, because essentially between the First and the Second Lombard League, so essentially the wars between Frederick I, fought respectively against Frederick I and Frederick II, we've seen it many times, the prerogatives, the hegemony of the Militants, that is, of the military knightly class of the Italian communes, had been successfully contested and properly destroyed by the populace. The populace were not really the shoemakers or the proletarians, whatever. They were basically all those who were not the militants, right? It's as if there had been a feudal. This happens in other areas of Europe, like in France, etc. You have the knightly class that rules in the High Middle Ages, right? In council, on the battlefield, from the top of their detre, right? They are really men of war, but they also, and especially in the entrepreneurial Italy, invest a lot in business, in the local market, in specialized crops, and we will see now today with the countryside with how important this was effective, but I don't even have to explain it, for supplying the city, right? And that's the big deal in many. many contexts think today about the food crisis, and it wasn't very different from those times, as we will see in a while. And they had made the city grow, right? Just like feudalism elsewhere had made European civilization, and consequently also the cities, the cathedrals, grow, right? So it occurred in this context where, however, the rest of the people, so everybody who literally was not a miles, right, and was not part of the militia, that was properly this, especially in Italy, this class, this sensual military elite that monopolized also kind of the politics, the council. It was the time of the consular class, became gradually to threatened. It enclosed itself. It was not able to absorb all the others that were also starting to have their own power and money. Think about the merchants, right? And it also had their own cavalry, let's say, but they were not as the milites temperamentally initially. And so the populace gradually substitutes to the milites that in many cases are, well, some actually sided with the populace itself at some point, because the populace was becoming the government. These were the arts, the guilds, they had already their own councils, their own paramilitary organization, and the commune still functioned with the idea that who was rich enough had to provide with the military service on horseback, or paying somebody for going for that. So also the spread of mercenaries that we have seen recently. But many milites are deemed to be so powerful, and not just milites, also some popular chiefs that become too invasive and dangerous and warring. They are exiled. They are expelled from the city. Their palaces, their buildings, their towers are destroyed in the city. There are furious urban clashes. And these people, however, can always rely on their possession in the countryside. Naturally, most people, most citizens in the commune had possession in the countryside. In the 13th century, we are at the peak of medieval civilization. So these communities are enormous, right? And there is properly a distinction, say, between citizens and commoners broadly meant, because the citizens really start becoming those who really own something, were part of an establishment, were maybe just very humble people, but they're part of that house, of that family, of that quarter, right? Whereas, the peasants, the proletarians from the countryside start coming, in fact, to work for them. They live outside the city walls in the suburbs. Sometimes, especially here, they have to build a second, a triple, sometimes even city ring, city walls around the older Roman one, because of the people that flow there. But those are kind of B-series, right? Second class people in general. The citizens start becoming really the those who count a lot, and there is an elite also within this citizen, and most of the citizens are those who factually own the land, right? And the milites originally had also come from the countryside. That is, these cities had always existed there. It's just that in early medieval times, in part of high medieval times, still there were important rural lordships, such as the one of Carolingian origin they were more feudal, say, than the Lombard ones. And so ideally it was a bit like in the other areas of Europe, where the landed, the elite was in charge because it owned land outside the city more than having an influence in the city that mostly gravitated around that estate in turn. In Italy, it had been the other way, right? The militaries had come to live in the city by maintaining, however, traditionally their castles, their holdings in the countryside. And some of these possessions, these assets, were true, like they were towns. These people still exercised some right, customary or feudal, publicly or privately recognized, that had been part of the broader seigneurial system in Europe. Say, I don't know, if you want to use this mill, you have to pay me something, etc. And so they ruled their own mini states in the countryside. Some were very powerful. I know if you pick the Pellavicini one in the Parmesan district. It was very powerful. It was just a parallel commune that existed out of that. And needless to say, these people always interfered in the countryside. So the big deal, especially during the expansion of the populace, had been from the side of the commune to extend the public control in arms, if words were not enough, on the countryside, right? Traditionally, this had not really been necessary because at the time of the militants that ruled, everybody, these militants had just ideally come to make business in town. They cared about the expansion of the commune because they came to monopolize it, actually to create it, because that's how it happened also in Italy. But they were still okay that they all shared more or less without a more centralized power, their own prestige, their own power itself in the city and in the countryside, right? Just they would start quarreling all the time. They behaved like mafia bosses, etc. So that's also partly why the populace, who was more directly interested in business, in trade, etc., was not happy at all that the militants every once in a while would, put the city, transform it into a battlefield. They would destroy the shops, whatever, because they were making their fighters among each other. And so gradually the enmity, let's say, between this nobiliar element and the commune, as it becomes kind of more like, in most cases, a popular commune, or at least one hegemonized by the populace, that still rules in part because of some of these noblemen that are supporting them, is the one that exists between the city and the countryside in the form of the elite that rules the city, and the elite that rules at least parts of the countryside. The thing is of obvious interest because, as we were saying before, the countryside is where the commune gets the wealth from, gets the supplies from, gets the grain, gets the food, literally, to maintain the people that work there. So all the cheap laborers that are ever more needed en masse to make, especially the textile industry in Italy, like in Flanders, and that become, these are some of the highest manufacturers in Europe by quantity and quality. So it's an enormously lucrative business. And of course, those who have been exiled from the city are not happy at all not to have their hands on it. And so there is, all throughout communal history, this constant conflict and sometimes open warfare, in fact, mostly in forms of raids, guerrillas, etc., and repression, tit for tat, between the communal army and the retinues of the militants, right? And it's very complex because the countryside also, as we've seen, has its own little communes, sometimes just rural ones, right? Not cities or towns, but there may be villages, and these are effectively also what make up great parts of the communal army, that has a very good hardcore of citizens, specialized infantry that is also very well armored by a certain degree, given that they were full of weapons, they produced them en masse, whatever. But especially the peasantry, the mass, right? These were essentially the majority made up the majority of the communal army, and ever more so, because the citizens gentrified, they do not want to go to fight anymore if those stinky peasants can do it for them. And of course, there is all a negotiation, in fact, between the these communities, and between this kind of internal conflict with the noblemen in the countryside that want to say, they try to seem more, let's say, more attractive, to appear more attractive with good or bad, convincing manners, let's say, than the same commune for these local communities, in fact. And as I was saying before, every commune is different. Like, you don't have full equality everywhere. There are major differences. For example, I don't know, in Lombardy, the people doesn't quite come to rule ever, right? The power is always shared with some greater nobility, with the bishop generally. And there are popular governments, and that ever get, as you know, as we've seen many times with the podestas and eventually with the signori, ever more hierarchized. It's all blended. But let's say, I don't know, the Tuscan ones are more democratic, if we can say, because they came up, later, but all at once. So there was less social stratification, and kind of the popular element was more important there. There are areas of Italy also that are less urbanized historically, like the northeast or Piedmont, right? Like they don't have large, big cities like you have in Lombardy or in Tuscany. The same true, in fact, normally along the Apennine, there are areas like Umbria or the Marches, or the Romagnol area that we will mention in a while, where, there are cities, there are communes, but the reaches, the scale of their power is much more limited in practice, and so there's also often a greater plurality of communes there, paradoxically, in spite they're smaller, and because of this tendential, as we'll see now, much more easily dominated, much more quickly, reverting to kind of an external influence, the one of the nobles of the countryside. So a very interesting game, because it gets very varied, and the various regime forms that are installed in these communes sometimes are very unique. We made videos about the Italian signories. I also made a playlist about that again. So basically, I've created tons of playlists about everything. How you can simply search for that. That is useful in part. I did it mostly for the algorithm, but it's functional. In any case, you understand. Yes, it's complex. But once you get the dynamic all together, it's all very simple, right? And it's also all too strikingly actual in comparison to contemporary times, for that matter. So the unification of the territory under the political supremacy of the city proceeded according to very different modalities, and also incoherently and weakly sometimes, because the communal government too wasn't stable at all, right? One faction could take over the other. They could use, in this sense, an external force from another city that was always, maybe subsidizing those same exiles in the countryside. You see, it's not really a class struggle. It's really a matter of faction, right? There are vertical as well horizontal divisions, but it's all very fluid. Right, there are factions that first are Guelph, then become Ghibelline, and others that do not really, you don't really know, because they really wait for the chance, and so everything can be profitably altered. Right, always remember this: political division brings to weakness in every field, also military, right, and especially military. So the commune could not always say, okay, well, we will simply now subdue the entire countryside with a campaign, it's over. No, it costed a freaking lot, and only in some cases it could be fully achieved, if ever, right? Historiographically, it's debatable whether it even ever happened practically, not just because the entire, we're still talking about ancien regime systems, so there is no such thing like an absolute state like in the 19th century, but also because factually there is always an area, corner somewhere that escapes the direct communal control. Because the commune, how would they have controlled everything? First of all, the countryside was populated. There were, it's true that Italy has a radical demographic, urban demographic concentration. So in certain cases you find literally that there are as many people living in the city as much as living in the countryside. Is something that until contemporary times you don't find anywhere in the world, because the cities were, again, so rich that they could afford to have all those people there. But this made them ever more vulnerable in that regard, comparing, towards the countryside, because, if the countryside was damaged, the greater the effect against the city, politically and socially, could be. And you easily understand why. And generally speaking, also, the military expenses are enormous, right? Sending even troops to tame this or that lord in some corner of the countryside is problematic, to say the least. First of all, because essentially, you don't have almost any of these Italian city-states that has like a district that lays solely in the flat land. There are maybe just some in the very center of the Po Valley, but all the others have either the Alps or the Apennine in the hinterland, and that's nightmare, right? You can't really. It's very hard to dislodge lords from there, and naturally these lords are historically entrenched in this kind of grim fortresses dominating passes and trade, the same trade of the Commune, the main highways, especially the great Alpine and Apenninic passes are radical importance because, again, and therefore even maybe a little seigneury that doesn't have much power in that area, however, becomes maybe the balance of the entire Italian political and strategic system, maybe exaggerating, but there are some of these situations. In fact, the struggles are really intermittently popping up everywhere in Italy, right? At some point there are concentrations, there are wars that last for maybe a couple of years in a row. They are really heavy, devastating. They erode society. They make people ever more tired. They don't want to pay, and so those who maintain this, keep up this struggle from the countryside, are very often facilitated, very often advantaged by the situation. They're the poorest one because they don't control the city, they don't control the flatland, right? But they can exercise a lot of pressure. And plus, as we've seen, they're paid, they're supported, also militarily, by the city rivals of the other cities that are always trying to knock each other out in a way or another, and to extend their hegemony on the others, also by proxy. And this is important. If you study the military campaigns that take place, are all coalition ones, right? If you have, I don't know, Milan that wants to fight against Pavia, for example, you always have lots of people that come. There's like the Milanese army, the communal army. Then you have the knightly, the noble houses of Milan, and then you have you have mercenaries as well. Foreigner, but then you have lots of noblemen. They may be handfuls, like 40 men, right? But they all add, right? Because they are elite normally. They're noble, they're heavy cavalry, etc. From, say, I don't know, Novara, from Bergamo, from Cremona, from areas that simply participate to the thing because they know they can profit. It's not just loot. Here we are past the seasonal warfare. Here we are in the hardcore phase of professionalization of warfare. Wars are waged with an enormous amount of resources spent. They are really devastating. And surprise, surprise, it's the countryside that suffers the most of it, right? The point is not much the loot in itself that is important, that they take away the chattel, the harvest, whatever, but they want to do that because they want to weaken the city. They want to exercise more pressure on the enemy city-state. And there are still leagues and there are still alliances. It's never like an individual city doing this without any kind of interference or alliance or whatever. So naturally, and then, yeah, maybe again, normally there are examples, for example, the aforementioned Parmesan one, where you have a very strong people there, and you have this, especially towards the end, in fact, of the 13th century, this regular and very methodic repression. It's literally the paramilitary of Parma, of the popular forces, accompanied by the Protestants and sometimes by some noblemen too, that go in the countryside and take out one by one all the various strongholds of these exiles that didn't want to be dislodged from the countryside. And it costs. I mean, you realize that mobilizing even just those thousands of men every time is something that weighs on the communal budget, that brings taxes to be increased, and also to further war, right? And you understand that for a medieval state, subduing this entire district takes really a lot. Also because you may think this district is small. There's something like rarely exceeding a few tens of kilometers in breadth and width, but they have, as we were saying before, a hyper concentration of people and wealth. So they're extremely difficult to control. Plus, exactly because they're small, they're actually part of a much larger system when you have all the pressure also from the external. So that why this is made all very complicated. So this full or virtually complete subjugation of the district was, attained, or at least almost at least, by those communes, only by those communes, the power which derived in prevalence from their own assets, right? Mostly in economical, commercial, and manufactural development. So communes that had also committed themselves more in organizing in more, satisfyingly rigid and uniform fashion the same countryside, right? By limiting the autonomies of the rural collectivities, especially the ones that were independent from the seigneurial dominion, right? This also was an issue because historically, going at war also with with some lords that were just part of the countryside and were also rooted in the city was also a big deal, was a problem. There were very powerful, these men. For example, the Guidi counts in the Florentine district, those were, it took a while before they could be dislodged. Those were the essentially the fifth column of the white Guelphs of the Ghibellines to Florence. They threatened, they brought, even at some point, to threaten the city entirely. So it was always very complicated to take out one by one those fortresses. You know how hard in the Middle Ages it is to storm a castle, how effectively you can defend it just with a handful of men and blocking an entire army for a very long time. So the example of Florence, paradoxically, is actually the best because that was simply the richest city, and paradoxically also spent less. That shows you how the richer you are, the less you want to spend, in the sense that you soften up, right? It's like us complaining now because of oil prices and whatever. We are full of money. We have a shitload of money. We have all to gain from still, holding on. And it's such a tragedy that we have to pay greater oil while people in the world get bombarded, right? So the issue there is a bit the same, but Florence is even so much more powerful and rich, especially that it can still, whenever it moves, it can mobilize alone the same army that Milan can do, right? Which is a much more systematically imperialistic and expansionistic system. And even waging war with multiple armies in the same season at the same time, which is something enormous, right? Just as we often say, it's just some kingdoms normally were able to do something like that at the time. And there is a culture there. As we were saying before, Lombardy and Tuscany were kind of historically even just the most urbanized areas. And so just because of that, as a consequence and a cause at the same time, they were more developed, right? They had a more statal-like system. Even though it differed, they were still more developed, right? They were richer, they were more resourceful, more populated, and their elite was also more capable because it was more involved in, on a larger scale, right? They wouldn't specialize individually much more on war themselves, depending on who they were. Also, there is in fact this areas the increase of mercenaries more than substitution eventually in the 14th century, as we were explaining some time ago, than other areas, but their politics is more far-reaching, right? Is more experienced, and it brings also with great difficulty to the further statalization of the system. Consequently, they can deliver more force, more concentrated force on the countryside, and attaining, in a way, that control that will eventually even come out of the countryside with the Italian regional states. And so with these cities that are so big and powerful, unlike the others, that basically swallow all the others and dominate them, right, and form even some kind of uniform states, like in the Duchy of Milan, etc., in Lombardy. This is very gradual. Again, always, we're talking about even here times that are not the ones we're discussing specifically today. But again, the premises that are set at this point are very important for later on, right? Also because this, again, is like the moment of the boom medieval civilization. Even the Italians here start, changing everything in historiography, in art, in administration, in trade, in banking, everything, right? But then in the mid 14th century, there's all the contraction, and so those who had capitalized the most, right? They had centralized the most, they had developed the most, are also the ones that have the best assets to, even in the moment of crisis, actually to secure control on the others, right? So reflected for contemporary times as well, because it's really, you can really look at the future in a way. Incidentally, those who instead do not want to pay for war, do not want to go war, they want to shout that they have the most populistic policy. They say no taxes, even though they're besieged from everywhere. They're the ones to fuck everything up, right? They're the communes that are swallowed before all the others, even though there were plenty of resources, because they are too weak morally, politically. And they let just sometimes even these kind of lesser powers locally, but supported by larger systems, taking over from within the same countryside. And this is actually, in fact, the story of the majority of the communes, because, again, as we were just saying, just a very few centers emerge as the hegemonic ones on the longer run. So how did the Italian communes normally control the district? Well, you have, as you understand, some offices, some administration. There is the appointment, for example, of local responsibles. Like just generally, the rural communities had their own councils, right? So they presented an official. The commune said yes, that they may deal with him, and then so it was. Or sometimes it was the imposition of so-called podestas that are not the ones of the city that rule the entire city, but like smaller ones, right? The mini version on a smaller scale for these local communities, or rectors, so holders, etc. Podesta comes from power, from potestas, right? As you understand. And naturally, these podestas and rectors of the commune were preferably communal citizens. They were people who came from the city that worked on behalf of the communal government. They took care of its interests, because it was also their own, right? The communal constitutions are very complex, but because the city, again, is a big system that has to work effectively, etc. So there is also very skilled personnel. As administrators have a lot of also left us, when we're lucky, a lot of documentation, right? Also because they had these rural communities were mostly important, not just because of the work of their in the fields, but because, again, as we've seen, they had to participate to the army. So these officials were sent in the local districts to examine whether, I don't know, the local troops were fit for war whenever the call was needed. They had their pikes, their manaries, their metal armor, and all these things. And the objective was also like kind of policing the same areas against the lords, the exiles, the bandits, those who were terrorizing the countryside and so on. That, however, these same communities could sometimes agree on, it would side with at some point. And as you understand, they also paid a toll, because the war was fought just there, so they were invested directly, right? When a big communal army came to raid the district, there are some cases that they crossed it from side to side, setting everything on fire. It was terrifying, right? So siding with one side, with one faction or the other, was not really an option. And this was the central core of the entire mentality at the time. So much that Dante, in his comedy, he was contemporary at this time, puts those who do not choose, who do not take political side, outside of hell, because the people in hell were better than those who do not have a political siding, right? Because they were responsible civically. And so even the damned were better than those who don't choose. They were worthier not to have them together with them. And it's all a brutal history, frankly. I mean, I presume most of historiography told the stories from a socio-economical perspective. If you study it even eventually from a political and military point of view, it's one of, again, this was easily the most belligerent area in Europe by amount of men and materiel deployed on a regular basis. Contamine explains this very well. There is an interesting bibliography about it. And in fact, the changes that are triggered by this are very fast, right? And the reason why, and this speaks, as we'll see now, of the general weakness of the commune, right? And so the statalization actually takes fully place in those communes that actually have control, manage to extend control in the countryside. Sometimes also the local lords were, however, allied, of course, with the city, as we've seen, normally would occur, right? There was always some noblemen in the city that were just to participate in the army. They had their own possessions in the countryside that wouldn't create trouble, right? So eliminating the seigneurial jurisdiction was a very complex process. It could also be resolved pacifically, right? But sometimes these jurisdictions were also very lucrative. So most of them would actually be given up by the same lords when they saw that, I don't know, the pressure was too high from the commune. They preferred to cooperate. They would be compensated one or another. They had opportunities also to urbanize further, right? So it's all depending on the situation. Other lords instead entrenched themselves and fought back, or they did both things sometimes, or they sided more with external powers, etc. And this instability of the city territorial construction results especially evident from the mid-13th century, right? In some areas, even further, of central northern Italy. As we were saying before, this is caused by the fact that even though the region was not under foreign attack anymore, paradoxically, the lack of a metus hostilis towards the foreign enemy would bring the Italian arms to be employed against one another, and so this would kind of weaken the commune further. Another reason is that at this point these communes had made it, so they had kind of relaxed and become richer and softer and gentrified. Also, this is, aside from municipal pride and rivalry, still, like, it's not entirely evident for, let's say, while you have, I don't know, the Barbarossa that arrives and has German administrators that do not even speak Italian, need an interpreter to negotiate. You see these guys and say, well, what the hell are they, right? Why are they here? If you're fighting instead against, I don't know, somebody who lives 10 kilometers away, the question is also, but, there is much less of a perceived threat, in a sense, by the idea that maybe it's better to surrender to that city because, after all, we're basically the same people in a way, or what is going to happen. Never underestimate how much they would hate each other guts, especially the next door neighbors, as always. But on the longer run, we're also talking essentially about the same country, right? Or even more, the same people in the same district, right? So it's not really evident why they should have held out so long against a system that was essentially being engineered more internally from a political and social point of view than just this kind of external rivalry, right? The reason why the system was unstable from a communal perspective is that maybe, if you hate a local politician and you think he's an idiot, and he wants to make you, for whatever reason, you're against him, at some point it would be preferable maybe your same city to be ruled by another 120 kilometers away than having this guy in charge, because that military invasion is less of a threat that the internal political and social problem that can create, right? Naturally, the further statalization actually increases the idea of separation in a way. But this passes because, again, also there are always larger super city dominations that encompass more cities at once. So you see that this internal resistance kind of fades at some point, also because the system gets exhausted. That is to say, until you have enough force and confidence, more material resources to put up a fight and say, okay, well, why should that city rule over me after all? You go on. But when, the system is just sinking and you see no light at the end of the tunnel, the countryside is ravaged, the people are starving, there are these loans, debts contracted over and over and over again by the commune. At that point, the system just collapses in the end. We can't really hope for anyone to really be thinking about themselves while the ship is sinking. In any case, there was a moment in which the difference was made, and very often it was made on the battlefield. What you realize is that the eventual decline passes through the actual defeat of the communal army in open field, like the wide majority of the time. Right? It's always the same plot. You have this clashes between two cities, and one is defeated in open field. Okay, so after the year after, that city that's been defeated gives its own seigneury to the other, right, say to the lord who was ruling over the other city, and that's it, right? There is still an autonomy. There is still, in that sense, the seigneury also presents with the advantage that normally you have to pay in money and you will give money to this guy. There are a lot. The exactions are very heavy, but at least he will just hire mercenaries and will spare the people from further military service. Also because, this wearing out the local army is ever less qualitative, right? Resorting ever more on the peasants and not arming them enough, etc. Also, that's why, as we were saying in that video recently, the condottieri took over, even just as a military model, because they're really something else from the system. Are there examples of it? There are plenty of examples. Today we could just mention, for example, the Romagnol communes that begin. The Romagnol communes are not particularly developed. This is important because the area that there are no big cities around. They're just kind of a cluster of cities like Ravenna, Imola, Faenza that historically didn't have much of a development. The big power is Bologna, close to them, but that's Emilia, not Romagna. And also down along the Adriatic coast, you just meet with the marches that have ever an even less communal development. And this is also paralleled by the fact that there are lots of powerful lords in the countryside, and especially in the neighboring Apennine. For example, the Montefeltro, that are some of the finest commanders of the time. These inhabit the Apennines, the Della Faggiola, for example, as well. Those specialize just to become podestas, and in this phase that equates essentially to the military commander of the communal army. That is called by communes because of military expertise. These live essentially as mercenaries. They are feudal families of the hardcore kind of Apenninic stock that just specialize in that and sell their service in some of the largest communes, like Pisa, like others. There was not necessarily even just a local proximity, also because maybe just they hated the communes that wanted to centralize in their own territory, in the interland, the closer ones. And Romagna arrives later compared to these other communes. I mean, in Lombardy and Tuscany, again, the thing had this attempt to subdue the countryside had occurred, has started much earlier. The Romagnol communes at this point try to do it because they feel probably under pressure, and they begin to attempt to expand in order to subjugate the surrounding territory. And this is when, among the families of the great families of the, in fact, of the counter-aristocracy, let's put it in this way, the aristocracy of the comitatus, right? Because these districts were originally the
the counties, right? And even before in Carolingian times, and even before Roman times, the dioceses. So that was the same normal administrative districts that had existed since also Lombard times, etc. They this feudal, this rural aristocracies, some are feudal, some are not, they are obliged to ally themselves with either one of the cities or another, but exactly for this they revealed themselves to be stronger than the urban centers. That is to say, you see how easily you can mess up the system through the same city, paradoxically, because it was enough to, at that point, say, I don't know, I'm a guy from the countryside of Imola, let's put it in this way, and the commune of Imola wants to subdue me. So what do? I become podestal, let's say, in the neighboring commune of Faenza, and I lead the army against Imola. So you understand, this was done by everybody respectively, but in this areas, in fact, the communes are so kind of limited power that at the end of the day, it's enough for the aristocracies to learn how to make this game, to check the same communal expansion in the territory and, thwarting the attempts of subduing their rural aristocracy. And to even take over the communes eventually as lords, as it will happen, right? And this is also fascinating, because some names that at the time of the Italian Renaissance we also connect to this great families of these cities were actually originally they were rural nobility that took over the city. They had nothing to do with that, just even by lifestyle, by background. So it's if you look at on the long run, what happens with the rise of the signories and the Italian regional states, and so essentially the systematic fall of all the cities at the hands of just a handful of ones over the region, you realize that a huge role was actually played by the noble guilds, let's call it in this way. These consortories were called because they swore to share the same source, the same fate altogether, as a blood pact, as was the one of the ancient military brotherhood, and sworn oath. And they managed to essentially surpass the commune. Right? They were smaller, but in that sense they were tougher. And also, like the rural aristocracy in general, having a bit more of this kind of decentralized background compared to the city, paradoxically was more habituated to have connections with people from other districts, right? This was just even a legacy of the feudal aristocracy of high medieval times in general. They were more exogamic, right, in a sense, than other systems, because they lived at the margin, after all, the city, and especially in Italy they had to go past, in fact, most of the areas that were largely dominated by the city in order to reach an agreement with someone, unless of course they agreed with the city, but never to take over. At least they rarely had the capacity of taking over. Like the way they would take over on the longer run was not in fact due to their rural possessions. The way it was due to the fact that as podestas and lords were called as military commanders, it would manage to maintain control of the city through the same city's resources, right? So it's an exquisitely political and individual ad personam career, if you want, that has a few to do with it. But in terms of the resistance, of the attrition that they put up, right, they managed to undermine the communal basis, very often taking over large part of the countryside and therefore cutting the supplies from the more fertile areas and essentially making the commune collapse under the pressure of the larger commune with which they had usually allied and with whom they would maintain usually kind of some cordial relations by ruling the countryside. This is typical, especially of certain areas like Emilia, for example, while the more decentralized, for example, Milan would historically take over the entire Lombardy. But there was this kind of blind spot, let's say, between Ferrara and in fact in Lombardy, let's say in the Emilian region, that was kind of more fluid, where communes were weaker, but the rural aristocracies were stronger, because it was kind of a buffer area, and the Visconti were kind of okay of not having too much of a strong power or city power there, that they should have also been battling on with the neighbors, with the Este, with others. And kind of granting that privatistic, decentralized, aristocratically, rural context, then, in fact, nurturing an important city in an area that could easily escape their own control. So this is the game, more or less, that happens. Of course, again, the larger city would also take over much more dramatically. Like, for example, speaking of the same Milan, if you look at this period by the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, cities like Crema, like Lodi, like Cremona, those would be, you understand that they basically, like, if you look at their army, their military activity, you understand that it decreases in a directly proportional way to the rise of the Milanese military activity, which means practically that they were just absorbed by Milan, right? And what was before the Lombard League was just the Milanese army at some point, because those places were taken out one by one, worn out. The local aristocracy, also in the same countryside, was kind of put under Milan. It was really not much of a time. So the degree of subjugation varies. It really depends on how the commune is located, what's also the original presence of important lineages locally. For example, as we were saying before, northeastern Italy has it has its own degree of urbanization, which is also an important one, but traditionally it has more like rural aristocratic presence, also in the affairs of the city, just tradition, right? This is not evident in Tuscany at large. This is more evident in Umbria, for example. So it really depends. In general, you see where the countryside is less wide and rich, also the aristocracy tends to be more powerful over the city, unavoidably, right? Even Genoa, that is a big city, again, is prey of effectively the local houses, doesn't have much of a strong public power, even though it's one of the largest, has, after Venice, the largest navy in Europe. But it's still privately run by the various houses, so that's very interesting. Also, and you could extend this concept up to saying that all the clashes that were fought in the cities were almost only the reflection of interests and contrasts that had in the country their unique, their authentic center. Because after all, it had always been like that since the times the Militants ruled, right? Even when the people took over, why were they always so distrustful and banning people and exiling them? Because even the city is made like a cake. Like, you have all these slices, and the corresponding area of the countryside outside the city gates of that quarter is connected to the interests of that quarter. So even, making war north rather than south, or east rather than west, is creating a great imbalance and within the same city. So it's obvious that because it reflects itself internally. And it can't, because, you don't want war to break out in the area where you have your land. So you will try your best to maybe avoid that. And by supporting the other faction. So it's always more conflictual, right? You couldn't really avoid that. Again, this is the political distribution of the cities. There's always some other city around, and you can't even predict what's going to happen next, because it's also depending on unpredictable factors like today, but still not in an easier one. So, and plus, again, for this very reason, the countryside remains the area of clash among the same noble factions, right? They all competed, right? When one of these guys became podesta or lord, well, the others said, wait a minute, you're becoming too powerful. After a while, they would say, it's enough. You're becoming too powerful. We'll overthrow you. And so it happens. And so the guy maybe flees to another countryside and maybe decides to come back, because so it's a constant feud that never ends. So basically the same nobiliar houses in the same countryside kind of exile each other. It's rough, like it's wild, it's brutal, and the countryside gets ravaged. Peasants get dispossessed, their house destroyed, they get killed, they get it's terrifying. Thus, this clash is characterized by countless private wars, usurpations, reprisals, uninterrupted crimes. And only the strongest communes, the more developed, the more advanced, the more saddle-like, practically make it. The ones that historically just suffer from backwardness, or at least from conditions that hadn't properly allowed to concentrate power in order to control the countryside, essentially lose. And again, this is a great reminder also for today, because you don't want to. Okay, well, I will not digress in this. I was thinking something about the concept of Westphalian, pre-Westphalian, post-Westphalian. It's never been such a thing, It's always been fighting with all the means you have at your disposal. War has always been about that. Politics has always been about that, as we know that war is just a continuation of politics with other means. It's always been that wild. Propaganda was all over the place here. We'll make videos about this too at some point, but just for saying that the idea of having a strong state that is strong for real, not strong because it's necessarily more authoritarian or more, but it's something that is functional because it has the right alchemy that makes things work for real and not just being anonymously, I don't know even how to say that. There are. What's very interesting sometimes is that, after all, some of the smaller states that are destroyed, sometimes they do show some degree, very high degree of resistance, of resilience, of individual quality and value, right? And so it's always a matter of balance, right? Not just because a power is under attack will resist per se, right? Some are in a way, some are in another. So are the invaders, the attackers, right? There are cities that are very powerful and rich, and some perform very well, some perform very badly, right? So it depends greatly on what was really the political and social balance internally. And this is what should be thought today. Because a messed up system, one way or another, is no good. Right? And you really need some assets and culture and intelligence that you will not simply find under a rock. Right? It must have been nurtured civilizationally from a long time in a ever more effective, updated way, which we'll not find again just a rain band at the moment. And in fact, it's almost it's very interesting. It's even some very agricultural lands were very rich in agricultural products, etc. Were some of which were less proclivious to put up a fight after all, because they were just agricultural. They didn't have much of a state per se. And so they had kept floating a while, but they hadn't developed that very highly structured power of the most advanced, pick mostly Milan and Florence in a continental sense, and that would take over, in fact, over some system. Conversely, there are some states that will take a longer time to decline, even over the centuries, because instead maybe they didn't outbalance themselves much in wars, etc., but they knew how to maintain control locally. Even when there were fierce struggles in the city, in the countryside, they still had a very measured, intelligent, considered attitude. They would even be involved with aids in some of the greatest wars of the time, even being defeated, but locally, by being very well conservative and using their resources carefully, they would manage to retain control and to survive even in this system, right? And there are also systems that kind of reduce the degree of democracy. Let's say some popular centers like Bologna, for example, there had been some of the fiercest against the magnates, against the anti-nobiliary, through the anti-nobiliar legislation, that take so many blows that decide they have to partially privatize, they have to partially give power to somebody, but never quite lose completely that degree of popular compaction and manage to remain factually autonomous, right? And going on with their life for some century or what. So again, the shades are very fascinating to observe, and hopefully we'll do it more fully on some other occasion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.